So I hope everybody had a great Halloween, but now that that's over, I'm going to do something that I've been putting off for a while. I wasn't sure how to approach it, but this is going to be something new for my channel. It's my first ever two-parter Revenge of the Remakes, and I'll be comparing the different versions of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. This first video is going to be what I like to call the pre-Disney era of Hunchback, and the second part is going to be the post-Disney version of Hunchback. And we'll compare all these versions and try to figure out which one is the best version of Hunchback out there. So now that I got all that out of the way, let's get into it.
Revenge of the Remakes.
The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So for this video, I'm going to be comparing the silent 1923 version starring Lon Chaney with the talking 1939 version starring Charles Laughton. And from here on out, I'm going to be referring to the 23 version as the silent version and the 39 version as the remake, because even though the remake was made by RKO and the original was made by Universal, it still is basically a retelling of the same story. So let's get into it. What is the story of these two Hunchback movies? Well, they're pretty similar. They both basically follow the same story, and you know it. There's a deformed bell ringer up in Notre Dame. He's all secluded. A bunch of gypsies come to town, including Esmeralda, and Esmeralda is just the most beautiful gypsy ever. So then you have Frollo, Phoebus, and Quasimodo all kind of pining for her affection. Some literal and figurative backstabbings ensue, and now you have your melodrama of Notre Dame. And while I haven't read the book, and I'm not going to be judging these movies on how accurate they are to the book because I haven't read it, so I can't really be a judge of that, I do feel like I have a decent understanding of what is in the book, and specifically what was most important to Victor Hugo in writing the book. He did not write this book because he wanted to tell a melodrama with this love square going on and all these corrupt and selfish people pining for the affections of a gypsy woman. He honestly couldn't have cared less about that. What he really wanted to do was raise awareness and respect for the cathedral itself. Because in his day, historical conservation wasn't a top priority for a lot of people, and the cathedral in Paris was starting to fall into disarray. And he felt that people didn't respect the old ways of storytelling through architecture since the printing press was invented. And from what I understand, the point of the book is more, even though evil things happen, tragic things happen, happy things happen, the cathedral will still stand. And the stories that the cathedral tells through its architecture and just structure will always endure. So understanding that, it's not that surprising that there were so many liberties taken with these characters and their characterizations from version to version. For instance, let's start off talking about Frollo. Now Frollo is an interesting case because in both versions, there's not just one Frollo, there are two Frollos. And the silent version does a really good job at establishing who's who, so we'll start with that one. So in this version, Claude Frollo is the Archdeacon of Notre Dame. He's played by Nigel de Bruyere. Probably not pronouncing that right, but whatever. Although he doesn't go by Claude Frollo, he goes by Don Claudio, because he's important. And he's actually a good guy in this version. He's not a corrupt priest. He's not after Esmeralda. He doesn't want her dead. He's the archdeacon that's nice to Quasimodo. He looks after him. He keeps the church in order and upholds God's laws and makes everything righteous, and he's fair. But it's actually his brother Jehan who's the bad seed, and he's the one that's after Esmeralda. So it's really Jehan who's the Frollo bad guy that we know. But what's weird is that he has no real authority. He's not a public figure. He just kind of lives in the cathedral with Claude, and he's kind of just this beggar, scavenger, kind of bad dude, and he looks really shady. And he's played by Brandon Hurst. Now in the remake, there's also a set of Frollos, the two brothers, once again. One's the archdeacon, and he's really good, and he's pious, and he's kind to Quasimodo, keeps the church in order. And we have the bad seed Frollo, played by Cedric Hardwicke. And unlike the silent version, where he just kind of hangs out in the cathedral and he looks real shady, here he still looks shady, but he's a judge. He's the minister of justice. He's someone of importance and sway over the legal system. But here's where it gets confusing, because they don't really say their first names a lot, even when they're just talking with each other. So I'm not entirely sure which one's Claude and which one's Jehan. I think the priest might be Claude. I think I heard him referred to as Claude a couple times, but I didn't hear the judge be called Jehan. Actually, he might have been called Jean? Just Jean? Or Jehan? I'm not entirely sure. But either way, this is still a very similar setup to the 23 version, and you can tell that they were heavily influenced by that version when they were crafting this story. But as for which version of the Frollos I like better, I think I have to go with the remake on this, just because they made Frollo a judge in this version so that he has a bit more authority and he's a bit more intimidating a villain. I feel like you're not just going up against him, you're going up against the entire legal system of France, and that's just a much more intimidating and awesome villain. Also, his delivery kind of reminds me of Snape from Harry Potter, and that's not a bad thing if you want to be an intimidating villain. But now let's move right along to everybody's favorite Captain of the Guard, Phoebus, the Sun God. So in the original, Phoebus is played by Norman Carey, and in the remake he's played by Alan Marshall. And in both versions they play him as you would expect Phoebus to be played. He's charming, he's a nice enough guy to hang out with, but he's a womanizer and he gives into his impulses a little too much, and he ultimately gets stabbed for it. But there are a couple differences, not so much in how the actors portray him, because they both give the same kind of charming swashbuckler Errol Flynn, Douglas Fairbanks type performance, but the differences really come in how Phoebus is used in the story. And I'm going to start with the remake on this one because he has a lot less screen time and a lot less to do in the story. He comes on the scene when Esmeralda's dancing and he immediately becomes infatuated with her, like you do. But from then on, Phoebus and Esmeralda have maybe 2 scenes together, and then he sees her at this other festival and takes her away, and they're about to sleep together in the woods, and then he dies, and we don't actually see how he dies, but we see Esmeralda holding a knife, and she's crying and she's sad, and Phoebus just never comes back. Phoebus is dead in this version, and it may be the only version in all the versions I'm going to be reviewing for you in this series where Phoebus dies and stays dead. I'm pretty sure in all the other versions he still gets wounded and he gets stabbed in some versions, but he always comes back. In this version, Phoebus dies and he stays dead. And what I do appreciate with this version is that we don't see who killed Phoebus. Going back to the silent version for a second, we see Frollo stab Phoebus in the back with a knife and then frame Esmeralda for it. We see all that. But in the remake, we don't see any of that, so it is kind of left to our own imagination as to what did go down. And there is a little bit of doubt that maybe Esmeralda did kill him. Although, by the end of the movie, you're pretty confident that it wasn't Esmeralda. But as great as that moment is, and as much as I appreciate killing him and actually keeping him dead for the rest of the movie, which is something that I really wish more versions did, I never bought into Phoebus and Esmeralda's relationship. They don't get nearly enough screen time, and I know they did that because they're really focusing more on the relationship with Esmeralda and Gringuire, which is interesting, and I'll get to him later, but Phoebus really gets lost in the shuffle there. Where in the silent version they had all those characters too, but they still crafted a Phoebus that you actually kind of bought him and Esmeralda's relationship. But there is one subplot that they do in here that really kind of bothers me, and it just feels kind of unnecessary. You just don't need it. And it's his relationship with Fleur de Lis. Apparently he's engaged to her and she's this aristocratic lady with a lot of money, and they seem to be happy enough together, but then he kind of just ditches her and goes off with Esmeralda and gets stabbed, and then it's Fleur de Lis that kind of nurses him back to health just so he can go off with Esmeralda again. It just, that whole thing doesn't do Phoebus's character any favors. It makes a character that's cool but flawed into just a jerk that you're like, dude, you have a fiance, like, have some restraint. It wouldn't bother me so much if there was some resolution between Fleur de Lis and Phoebus and Esmeralda, and they had a big confrontation towards the end, and they had to settle this love triangle. But no, all this just kind of falls away and is never really addressed again when the big climax is going down. But even though that whole love triangle is kind of superfluous, I still have to give it to that version for delivering a Phoebus that actually has some chemistry with Esmeralda, that actually gets good romantic scenes with her. But now let's talk about our leading ladies who play Esmeralda. You have Patsy Ruth Miller, who plays Esmeralda in the silent version, and you have Maureen O'Hara, who plays her in the remake. And both these actresses do a fine job. They're both pretty, they both can dance, and they do the whole tambourine thing. And really, there's no contest here. I have to give it to Maureen O'Hara. Patsy Ruth Miller does a good job, and she's okay for being the Esmeralda of the 20s. But Maureen O'Hara just brings so much to the role. You hear the desperation in her voice when she's pleading with Frollo and the king and anyone that'll listen for some kind of justice for her people. But she also gets some quieter moments. There's a really powerful moment when she's in the church and she's praying for the first time. And this is straight up where Disney got the inspiration for God Help the Outcast. And even though this version doesn't have that really awesome song attached, it's still a really powerful scene. And Maureen O'Hara delivers it perfectly. And even though, like I said earlier, she doesn't have great chemistry with Phoebus, she does kind of make up for that with her scenes with Gringuire, who she doesn't really love, but they work out this kind of brother-sister kind of relationship, which is a little weird because they're married, but she doesn't really want to sleep with him, she doesn't love him in that way, so they just kind of hang out together and they treat each other nice enough. And it's that caliber of writing that I wish was used in the scenes with Phoebus and Esmeralda earlier to kind of flesh out their romance. But even so, it is still there with her and Gringuire. But really the biggest thing that separates these two Esmeraldas is that this Esmeralda is actually a gypsy. Yeah, the Esmeralda in the silent version turns out isn't a real gypsy, and this is another subplot that is just kind of unnecessary, it's just kind of dumb, and I'm glad that the remake just threw it out and it really hasn't come back in any version since. And it's that Esmeralda was the daughter of a noblewoman and she was captured by gypsies when she was a baby, raised to be a gypsy, and her birth mother went mad, and she's so prejudiced against the gypsies that she just wants them all to leave, and she really is crazy, until she finds out that Esmeralda has the locket that she's had since she was a baby that proves that she is her daughter, and they cry, and it is kind of a touching scene, but it just kind of undermines one of the themes in the story that the remake really plays up, and it's the idea that the gypsies are being persecuted because of their race, and that's unfair, and that they deserve the same rights as native-born Parisians. And Esmeralda in the remake is one of the most vocal about this injustice, and when you just make her the daughter of a noblewoman, she loses that identity as being part of the persecuted group. And it would be one thing if this actually went somewhere, and maybe that puts a wedge between her and Clopan, her adopted father, but there's none of that. There's no point in making her the daughter of a noblewoman. But anyway, let's talk about the real star of this movie, and it is Quasimodo. In the silent version, he's played by the iconic Lon Chaney, and in the remake, he's played by Charles Laughton. Now, both these actors do a great job, and it's really Lon Chaney's performance is why I return to the 1923 version every so often, which is really saying something because there are not many silent era films that I'll just return to because I feel like it. And it's because Lon Chaney's performance is so amazing. He's under so much makeup and plaster and chemicals. I don't even know what he did to make this makeup work, but from what I understand, he had this big old plaster hump that was more or less glued to his body. It was incredibly painful to apply and work in, but he made it work. He suffered for his art, and it is so impressive for the time. But what's really amazing is how expressive it is. The range of emotion that Lon Chaney can convey through this makeup is staggering. I don't understand it. When I first saw the movie, I just figured like, oh, it's just this big bulky kind of mask that he's wearing. But his mouth moves, his eyes move, his eyebrows move. Now Charles Laughton, on the other hand, they do a really cool thing where they've moved one of his eyes. One of his eyes is just completely covered by makeup, and the eye is actually on his cheek, I think. And when he moves his face and scrunches his face in some ways, it actually looks like the eye is blinking. And that's really impressive for 1939. It's probably not as painful an appliance to work in as Lon Chaney's, but I can't imagine it was that comfortable either. But one big difference is that Lon Chaney's performance is very physical and acrobatic. You feel like this dude is scaling Notre Dame. He's doing jumps and swings and a lot of seemingly death-defying stunts, where Charles Laughton doesn't get that as much. There's a couple moments when he's swinging on the bells and there's some physicality on there, but it's nowhere near the degree to which Lon Chaney did it in the 20s. But I think the true testament to what makes a good Quasimodo is how much you sympathize with him. Now in both versions you feel bad for him, but you feel bad for him in different scenes. In the silent version, the big scenes where you feel bad for him is on the pillory, and then towards the end when he dies. Yes, he does die at the end of this version. He gets stabbed in the back when he's fighting with Frollo and he dies. But in the remake, he doesn't die, and you also don't really feel bad for him on the pillory. He just kind of takes it like a champ. He just hangs his head down, doesn't move, doesn't cry, doesn't really give any kind of emotions, where you look back on Lon Chaney and the dude is just screaming and howling in pain and you feel so bad for him. But Charles Laughton doesn't really do that, and it is kind of a missed opportunity. But that is more than made up for with the scenes after Phoebus dies and Esmeralda is hiding out in the cathedral with him, and him and Esmeralda have a heart-to-heart. And he says some really touching lines where he never knew that he was so ugly before he saw how beautiful Esmeralda was, and that she was the only one that ever showed him pity, and he just opens up his heart to her. and it's very sweet. And for a moment you feel like Esmeralda might actually just stay with him forever, but you know that's not going to happen. But it is a very sweet moment. And in this version, Quasimodo does survive. He doesn't die, and I think it's more tragic keeping him alive in the bell tower with his only friends, the gargoyles, to keep him company. And I'll talk about why I like that a bit later when I wrap up, but for now, just know that both of these actors did an amazing job. They both bring such character and personality to the role of Quasimodo. But at the end of the day, I do have to give it to Charles Laughton. He's the one that by the end of the movie I pitied the most and felt more of an emotional attachment to. But now, before I give my final thoughts, let's talk about Gringuire, because Gringuire is the crux of whatever message you're hoping to convey with Hunchback of Notre Dame. I suspect Gringuire was made to be kind of the author's POV character. He's a poet, he's an intellectual, and he tries to get in with the gypsies. In the silent version, he's played by Raymond Hatton, and in the remake, he's played by Edmund O'Brien. Now, as for who was the best Gringuire, it's an easy one. It's the remake. He just gets more screen time, he gets more development with Esmeralda. He actually marries Esmeralda, and that's made very clear, versus in the original where he just kind of becomes a gypsy. Esmeralda does save him from being hanged like in the remake, but there's really no talk of them getting married and there's no commitment there. He just kind of gets saved and now he's a gypsy. Going back to the point of these movies, it really does rest on how you do Gringuire. In the original, it's a lower class rising up against the upper class, and specifically the king. The movie makes it very clear that King Louis XI was a bad king. He oppressed his people. He had an unfair justice system and was just corrupt and bad and needed to be overthrown by the people. Which is interesting considering that the remake shows a lot more of King Louis XI, and he's played by Harry Davenport. And he's presented as an old man kind of set in his ways for sure, but he's ultimately a good king. He wants to move forward with progress, and he's keeping an eye on the developing technologies and ways of thinking. And he is very entertaining and has a few really good lines, but he is nowhere near the scoundrel of a king that was depicted in the original. And that's because the remake is much more nuanced and is more about the gypsies coming into the country having the same rights as natural-born Frenchmen, and how the advent of the printing press can form a public opinion against the king to force even kings to make decisions based on the people, creating a somewhat more democratic form of government. And I like this take on Hunchback a lot more because it's a much more human story. There's no plain good or evil. Everyone's kind of a scoundrel. Everyone's a bit of a contradiction. And they're just trying to make Paris a more just place. But it also works in the printing press of the story, which was the main reason why Victor Hugo wrote this book in the first place. Because of how the printing press fundamentally changed the way that citizens took in information. They didn't take it from cathedrals anymore. They took it from the written word. And any Hunchback movie that can address that in a way that doesn't feel completely forced is doing a good thing. So at the end of the day, which version do I like better? It's the 1939 remake. It did what a good remake should do. It stepped up the story in drama, in character, in plot, without it feeling too clustered or convoluted. And it kind of did away with some of the subplots that were a bit superfluous in the original. And it just packs more of a punch. And it is a shame that this movie had to come out in 1939, arguably the greatest year in American cinema. Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Of Mice and Men, and now Hunchback of Notre Dame. And as great as it is, when it came out, it got kind of buried under all the other really awesome movies that were made that year. But even though Hunchback is no Gone with the Wind or Wizard of Oz, it still deserves its place among the great movies that came out that year. And just as a final note, the thing that I love the most about this version of Hunchback of Notre Dame, it has the most perfect ending to any Hunchback movie that I've seen. And it's just Quasimodo sitting on top of the cathedral, talking to his friend the gargoyle, just being sad and alone, asking the gargoyle, "Why was I not made of stone like thee?" And that is just the core of the tragedy that is Quasimodo's life. And I think by keeping him alive, but also keeping him alone and sad, it adds to the mythos that Victor Hugo, whether he planned to or not, created with Hunchback of Notre Dame. And for me, I just love the idea that Quasimodo will just always be the bell ringer of Notre Dame. That if I happen to go to Paris someday and come across Notre Dame and hear the bells ringing, I can think, oh, maybe that's Quasimodo up there ringing the bells. Even though there's no way that he's still alive after all these years, but the mythos is still there. And if you kill off Quasimodo, that fantasy is gone. There's no way that Quasimodo can be ringing the bells because I saw him die on screen. But if you see him alive at the end of the movie just with the gargoyles, he just becomes kind of a living gargoyle. He'll just always be a part of Notre Dame ringing the bell. And that's why The Hunchback of Notre Dame endures so well as a story, because everyone can look up at the tower and imagine what kind of monster is up there ringing the bells. But now I turn it over to you guys. Which version of Hunchback do you like the most among these two? We'll talk about the Disney version and the off-Broadway version next time. But for now, just leave your comments to these two versions. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.